The Coral Castle Mystery: How One Man Moved 30-Ton Stones Alone. If you enjoy the content, please consider subscribing and liking the video. It truly helps the channel grow and continue to create contents like this. Alright, let's talk about a place that doesn't feel ancient, doesn't feel mythical, and yet somehow feels more unsettling than ruins that are thousands of years old. A place that exists right here in the modern world, surrounded by highways, palm trees, and suburban neighborhoods, yet refuses to make sense once you really start paying attention. A place built in plain sight during the 20th century by a single man working alone, using stone blocks so heavy that even today they would normally require cranes and teams of workers. This is the Coral Castle. And what makes this mystery different from almost every other one is that it isn't buried under centuries of myth or filtered through ancient legend. This happened recently. People were alive to see it happen. Newspapers mentioned it. Engineers studied it. And still, no one can fully explain how it was done. The story begins with Edward Leedskalnin, a Latvian immigrant, a quiet private man. Physically small, almost fragile, about 5 feet tall, barely over 100 pounds. Not someone you would ever look at and assume could move multi-ton stone blocks by himself. Not someone who looked capable of doing the kind of work Coral Castle required. Edward came to America after a personal heartbreak. His fiancée, often referred to as his Sweet 16, called off their engagement just before they were supposed to be married. Whatever that loss did to him, it changed the direction of his life. He never married. He never really moved on. Instead, he decided to build something. What he built over the next several decades was extraordinary. The Coral Castle is made almost entirely of coral limestone, quarried from the ground beneath it. Massive walls, stone furniture carved from solid rock, tables, chairs, beds, thrones, towers, and sculptures, carefully placed alignments that track celestial events. Individual stones weighing several tons, with some estimates pushing close to 30 tons. And Edward built all of it alone, at night, in secrecy. Neighbors said he worked only after dark. He discouraged visitors. He lived on site in a small, simple shack. Children who tried to spy on him later claimed they saw stones floating in the air. That sounds absurd, obviously, but the fact that people reached for explanations like that tells you something important. They couldn't reconcile what existed with the man they saw. There's no solid evidence Edward used heavy machinery. No cranes, no engines, no large crews. What he did have were simple tools: chains, pulleys, tripods made from wooden poles, levers, and patience. A lot of patience. And yes, from a purely mechanical standpoint, it is possible to move enormous weight using leverage and pulleys. Humans have known this for thousands of years. Ancient builders relied on the same principles. So on paper, the Coral Castle shouldn't violate physics. But theory starts to wobble when you look closely. This wasn't crude construction. The stones are placed with precision, tight tolerances, balanced loads, clean geometry. This wasn't brute force. This was controlled, deliberate placement. The kind of precision that suggests planning, not improvisation. And then there's the gate. The most famous feature of the Coral Castle is a massive revolving stone gate weighing roughly 9 tons. A solid slab of coral limestone, balanced so perfectly that while Edward was alive, a child could open it with one finger. No motors, no visible bearings, just stone moving effortlessly. Years later, when the gate finally stopped working, engineers had to dismantle it using modern equipment just to understand how it functioned. Inside, they discovered a metal shaft and a truck bearing used as part of the pivot system. Here's the part that still has no clean answer. How did Edward drill a perfectly straight, vertical hole through 9 tons of coral limestone, align it precisely, and balance it with that level of accuracy by himself? No one knows. And Edward never explained it. Instead, he spoke cryptically. He claimed he understood the secrets of the pyramids. He talked about magnetism, weight, and invisible forces. He wrote small pamphlets about magnetic currents and cosmic energy. Some dismiss this as eccentric rambling. Others think he was hinting at something deeper, But even if you strip away every mystical claim, you're still left with an uncomfortable fact. One physically unimposing man accomplished a feat of stone construction that rivals ancient monuments without leaving behind a clear method. And unlike ancient builders, Edward didn't have a civilization behind him. No workforce, no state support, no inherited tradition, just intent. The coral castle isn't random, it isn't chaotic, it's deliberate, symbolic, thoughtful. This wasn't just about moving rocks, it was about meaning. And maybe that's the key. Edward wasn't building for an audience. He wasn't building for fame. He wasn't even building for history. He was building for someone who never came to see it. When you remove deadlines, approval, and the need to explain yourself, the limits on what's possible change dramatically. And yet, even knowing that, the coral castle never fully settles into a comfortable explanation. Because Edward didn't just build it once, he moved it. He dismantled the entire structure and relocated it miles away, again working alone, again mostly at night, again without explanation. That's where the mystery hardens. In the next part, I want to step away from the stones themselves and talk about what Coral Castle really challenges. Not physics, but our assumptions about labor, time, and individual capability. Because this story isn't asking us to believe in magic. It's asking us to reconsider the limits we quietly accept. The deeper you go into the Coral Castle story, the less it feels like a mystery about engineering, and the more it feels like a mystery about mindset. Not about what Edward Leedskalnin could physically do, but about how we think, effort, time, and human potential are supposed to work. We live in a world where big things require big systems, teams, permits, budgets, timelines, machines, oversight. We're trained to believe that scale demands infrastructure. So when we see something massive, our instinct is to look for the system behind it. Edward didn't have a system. He had solitude, and that changes everything. Engineers who study Coral Castle often point out that nothing Edward did technically violates the laws of physics. That's true. Pulleys, levers, counterweights, balance. These are powerful tools. Given enough time, a small force can move enormous weight. But there's a difference between theoretical possibility and lived execution. Edward didn't just move stones. He placed them precisely. He balanced them. He integrated mechanical principles into static architecture. And he did it consistently, without obvious mistakes, without assistance, over decades. That level of consistency is rare. And then there's Edward himself. He didn't talk much. He didn't explain himself. He didn't seek recognition. He didn't aggressively monetize the mystery. He charged a small admission fee later in life, but never chased fame. That suggests his motivation wasn't external, which is unusual. Most monumental builders want to be remembered. Edward seemed almost indifferent to being understood. He allowed speculation to grow. He allowed myths to form. He never corrected them. That silence matters. When someone refuses to explain their process, they create a vacuum, and vacuums invite mythology. Floating stones, anti-gravity, lost ancient knowledge, magnetism. The less Edward said, the larger the mystery became. And it's entirely possible he knew that. Some people think Edward deliberately cultivated the mystery as a quiet rebellion against a world that underestimated him. Others believe he genuinely thought he had rediscovered fundamental truths about physics that mainstream science ignored. But here's a possibility that's actually more unsettling than either. What if Edward's true advantage wasn't secret knowledge at all? What if it was time, unlimited time, no deadlines, no schedules, no productivity pressure? If it took weeks to move a stone a few inches, that was fine. If it took months to align a single block, that was fine. No one was watching. No one was paying him by the hour. That kind of temporal freedom barely exists anymore. And when you combine unlimited time with clever mechanics, the impossible becomes inevitable. That's exactly what engineers eventually saw when they examined the famous gate. They didn't find magic. They found balance, precision, an intuitive understanding of friction and load distribution. But intuition developed in isolation. Edward didn't teach anyone. He didn't document his methods clearly. He didn't pass the knowledge on. When he died, whatever refinements he developed died with him. And this is where Coral Castle connects to much older mysteries. Knowledge doesn't disappear because it's impossible. It disappears because it's personal. Civilizations preserve techniques through repetition and teaching. Individuals do not. When an individual's process isn't shared, history loses it. That's why Coral Castle feels ancient, even though it isn't. The structure remains, but the method is gone. And there's another uncomfortable truth hiding underneath all of this. Coral Castle exists in a fully modern world. Engineers examined it. Journalists documented it. This isn't ancient ignorance colliding with modern science. This is modern expertise encountering something that doesn't fit its assumptions. And when that happens, we often look for exotic explanations instead of difficult ones. The difficult explanation is this: human capability is broader than we like to admit, especially when it operates outside institutions. One determined individual, given enough time and focus, can do things that look impossible when judged through modern expectations of efficiency. That realization is unsettling because it suggests our limits may be cultural more than physical. Edward Leedskalnin didn't build Coral Castle because he was superhuman. He built it because he refused to live inside the constraints most people accept: visibility, speed, approval, explanation. And when you remove those constraints, the ceiling on what's possible rises. That's why Coral Castle lingers in the imagination, not because it proves lost technology or hidden forces, but because it quietly implies that the world is more flexible than we think, that someone small, ignored, and heartbroken could carve permanence into stone and leave behind a structure that still resists full explanation, not because the answer is unknowable, but because the person who knew chose silence, and that may be the most powerful mystery of all.